Hey, this is Josh Brown with Life Report here with another listener mail question. I really like this question because this is about how to dialogue with clarity and avoid miscommunication. So this is from, I think your name is pronounced Andres from Santa Barbara, California. He says, how do you avoid offending the other person when making analogies? I had a discussion a few months ago with a fellow student at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and I brought up an analogy that involved a machine that supported a grown person. Specifically, I wanted to show that even if a person was completely dependent on the machine and the people that run it, they still have personhood. But the person I was talking to responded by saying, "Are you comparing a woman to a machine?" He says, I do not know what went through his mind, but it might be that this experience confirmed in his mind that pro-lifers see women as, quote-unquote, baby-making machines, or as inferior to men in some way. What would you suggest we do to avoid throwing people off when the analogies we use seem at a surface level to demean pregnant women? I really like this question. So I was thinking about this today, and I just jotted down 6 quick tips for avoiding confusion when using analogies. So my first tip is make sure you're communicating clearly. I like the way my brother Tim says it. He says, clarity is our friend. That's become one of like the running mantras in my mind. And miscommunication is really easy. Miscommunication is easy, especially when talking about an issue like abortion. Miscommunication is really easy online. People not always understand what the other person means or what tone they mean to use. And so you want to try to avoid that if you're going to have a good dialogue. And so, I mean, one of the things I would be asking is, did you start by actually saying that you're making an analogy? Or do you just go in with something like, this is probably not the case, but if you kind of started in with, well, if there's, like, imagine there's a baby-making machine. Like, if you start in just quite like that, you know, they might get confused. Whereas a lot of times what I want to do is to say, okay, I've got an idea. Let me try to make an analogy that'll make this more clear. So here's my analogy, and then I'll make the analogy. And at least then I've kind of said, you know, it's almost like a get ready, I'm going to make an analogy. It should be really, really obvious. So tip number 1, make sure you're communicating clearly. Tip number 2, narrate the debate. We've talked about this before in Life Report. This is not my term. I think it's Greg Kuckel's term with Stand to Reason, but either way, and he talks about it in his book Tactics, which is, if you haven't read Tactics, you really, this is basically a tactics question. You should read Greg's book. But narrating the debate basically means you kind of pause the discussion. And if at this point it might feel like a debate. So hopefully you're having a dialogue, not a debate, but you kind of pause and you kind of step outside of the debate. So I kind of like just in my head, kind of my image in my head is like there's like the two people and you kind of pause and then step to the side, almost as if you're a moderator. So you're stepping away from being, you know, pro-life debater role or dialoguer role to the moderator role and kind of saying, let me show you what I see happening right now. I'm not going to make an argument. Let me just explain. I think we're talking past each other, or I think there's been a miscommunication, and so I'm going to try to explain what I see, and we can, you know, try to make sure. Let's try to get on the same page, and then we'll jump back into it, and we'll, you know, go back to asking questions and having our dialogue. So I might say something like this. I might say, you know, it's important to me that you understand what I was trying to say. I think you accidentally misinterpreted what I was saying into something a lot less sensitive than it actually was. I don't think women are machines. I'm trying to make an analogy to demonstrate my view that being dependent on something else doesn't change your value. My view might be wrong, and I think making an analogy would be a helpful way to explain my view so that you can respond to it. So let me actually kind of explain, just give a little running commentary to why I wrote that out that way. I started by saying it's important to me that you understand what I was trying to say. Okay, so you've just explained, here's why you're narrating the debate. You're going to try now to explain where you're coming from because it's important that he actually understands where you're actually coming from. And this, everyone wants to be clearly, you know, correctly understood, accurately understood. So you're saying it's important for me that you understand what I was trying to say. And I said, I think you accidentally misinterpret. I like that idea. A lot of times misinterpretations are not on purpose. People just get confused, especially if they kind of come into the dialogue with this negative kind of presupposition about who you are. I make light of it in speeches sometimes, but it's really true. Pro-life people and pro-choice people sometimes come to the table with these, most of the time, inaccurate, not just misrepresentations, but even like caricatures of each other. Caricature like the cartoons where someone that's got a slightly bigger nose than usual, like has a really big nose. So that's why I use the word caricature. Like pro-life people sometimes think of pro-choice people as just most people that don't care about babies, or maybe even hate babies and only care about women and having the freedom to have sex whenever you want. And there's kind of these kind of negative stereotypes. And then pro-choice people sometimes have this stereotype of pro-life people that we're just a bunch of grumpy old men who want to control your lives, and we want things to go back to the quote-unquote good old days when women couldn't vote, and we're in the kitchen, barefoot, making dinner and breastfeeding twins. Like that's kind of the way I talk about it on stage. But while I'm kind of making a joke of it, there's truth to that. And we don't want to come to the table with these caricatures of each other. And then the next thing I said was, I don't think women are machines. I said that because you're actually not, now you're trying to correct the misrepresentation. Once again, clarity is our friend. So be really, really clear. Okay, you think, or you seem to think that I think women are machines. That's not my view. Just want you to know, that kind of thing. And then you're explaining what you're trying to do. I was actually instead trying to make an analogy to demonstrate my view that being dependent on something else doesn't change your value. So you're really clearly, this is what my intentions were and are. I want you to understand my view. I think by using an analogy, that's gonna make my job easier so we can have a good dialogue. And that's why the next thing I say is, my view might be wrong, and I think making an analogy would be a helpful way to explain my view so that you can respond to it. You're not saying that you're definitely right. We want to be open-minded people. We want to be learners. So it's not like I'm making an analogy because I think it's going to, it's very rhetorically powerful and it's going to force you to admit that I'm right. No, you're just saying, look, I have this view. It seems like right now the debate, rests on this belief that I have that your personhood is not dependent on dependency or a degree of dependency. And so let me make an analogy that explains kind of where I'm coming from or why I believe that, and then go for it. Like this actually might make it easier for you to refute my view or to, ask a question that challenges it or whatever. So everybody should be fine with this. This should be fine. So I think narrating the debate that way is very, very clear. It's not awkward. It's not weird. You should be able to just move on from there, hopefully. But what if the debate keeps on or the dialogue keeps on getting messed up? I have a tip. That's where tip number 3 comes in. Maybe suggest kind of a golden rule of dialogue. And I don't know where I heard this. It makes me think probably Steve Wagner or my brother Tim. But somebody said, reason the way you want others to reason. Say something like, look, I am going to do my best. This is my commitment to you in this dialogue, especially since we're talking about something as emotional as abortion. I'm going to do my best to interpret all of your arguments and all of your analogies in the most charitable way possible. And I'm asking that you do the same thing to me. I'm not a jerk. You might even say, I'm not a creepy guy that actually thinks women are machines. So as we make arguments and analogies or analogies, it's, either of us could kind of respond, like just assume the worst about the other person. How about instead of that, we both kind of agree to try to assume the best about each other, and then we'll let each other prove each other wrong. For example, for you, not everybody who's pro-choice deserves the most charitable interpretation of their views. There are some pro-choice people, just like there are some pro-life people, that if you kind of assume the best from the beginning, your assumption is actually not the accurate one. It was more accurate that it's somewhere in the middle, or maybe they're just jerks. But start out by assuming the best and kind of let them prove you wrong. And at some point, at some point, it's not like I'm saying if the person calls you an idiot 10 times and then like slaps you in the face, keep on assuming the best. No, at some point, I think, the the evidence is on the table. I'm just saying, don't start out with like, I'm going to assume the worst about what this guy says. And that's really important to good dialogue, is trying to establish that. And so I might just tell the person, I've already tried to explain what I'm trying to do with this analogy. You keep on interpreting my analogy in like the worst possible way, and I don't think that's accurate of where I'm coming from. I can explain why. If you want to grill me on that, just ask me, do you think women are like machines? I'm going to say, no, not at all. I think women are wonderful. They're very valuable human beings, just like, equally valuable with men and all. Like, I think I'm the equal human rights guy, here, I think. That's what I'm arguing for, even unborn women. So that might help depending on the person. Tip number 4, explain what analogies are. Analogies are just analogies. If there is no perfect analogy. If there was a perfect analogy, it would no longer be called an analogy, or be called, I don't know, a real life example or something like that, a real life illustration or whatever. Like, it's an analogy. And you typically, in an analogy, there are certain points that are important and certain points that are not important. And you want to try to be focusing in on the important or relevant parts of an analogy. So like with the violinist story, the most famous pro-choice arguments, we've talked a lot about it. If you haven't seen that, go to prolifepodcast.net, click on any post. It's a blog post, just because to get to what I'm trying to direct you to, you can't see it on the front page, but you can see it on every other post. If you scroll down to the bottom on the left side, you'll see a tag cloud. You can see a bunch of, it's where the tags, like the words that, or the tags that we use most often, are in bigger font than the other ones. Bodily rights is a tag that we use often, because I think pro-life people need to be better prepared to respond to bodily rights arguments. So in the violinist story, the mistake is when the pro-lifer says, focuses in on some part of the analogy that's not important, like whether it's even feasible to be hooked up to anybody with your kidneys. Like if they're like, well, that's a dumb analogy because, we don't have the technology to do that. That's not the point of the analogy. That's the wrong move for the pro-life person. And Trent Horn, I think, is the one who made the analogy on our show, where it's like if someone did it, one of these, train tracks, analogies or thought experiments. If the train keeps going, it's going to run over one person or 5 people, and then if you flip the switch where you're actually taking an action, it's only going to run over one person, but it still ran over one person. There's these ethical thought experiments, and these is like, what if we added one thing that said that the train is powered by a nuclear reactor the size of a matchbox? Okay, well, that's not technically feasibly possible with modern science, but that wouldn't matter. That wouldn't change the ethics, like, what is the right answer here at all. So you want to try to help people to focus in. So you want to try to make analogies as kind of as accurate as possible, but mainly you want to focus on the, what is the analogy that I'm trying to make? You know what I mean? If they're making an analogy, focusing on the things that are morally relevant. So for the violinist, that would be, do parents have any more obligations to their own kids than other people do? That's a morally relevant question. There's pro-choice answers for it, but that's a morally relevant question. Is there a relevant difference between the womb and having your womb connected to your child and having your kidney hooked up to your child? That's a morally relevant question, regardless of how that gets answered in your discussion. So focus on that. Maybe just let the person know analogies are just that, analogies. Number 5, you might want to explain. I made this towards the end on purpose, because you don't want to start with this, or this would be a little bit antagonistic. But you might just say, and I've said this once to someone, and I told the story once before on Life Report, where this pro-choice person online on a Facebook kind of a debate group had kind of told me that she didn't think any analogies, like pro-lifers can't use analogies. And I said, you really don't want to go make that rule, because if we're going to throw out all analogies, then pro-choice people lose some of their best arguments. Some of the most rhetorically powerful arguments that pro-choice people have are from analogies. For example, the violinist story. It's like one of the most famous modern philosophical thought experiments, or analogies. And if you lose that, you lose a lot of ground, I think. And so I think, if you're going to say I can't use any analogies, fine. I can actually make a pro-life argument without using any analogies. I'm going to make my argument from equal human rights. And most people agree that humans are equally valuable. And I can make my argument from that without any analogies. I think actually if we're going to take away all analogies, like if it's going to be fair to both sides, pro-lifers have a much better, are in a more strategic, a better spot. Like having if we were Jedis, we'd have the high ground. That's you know what I mean. So I think you probably don't want to. I might just suggest. I think this is how I would probably say it to the pro-choice person. I say, look, I think you don't want to make a rule that says no one gets to use analogies, because then you'd be throwing away some really powerful arguments that the pro-choice side has that are made from analogies. So how about let's both use analogies, and we'll talk about those analogies. And if the analogies are bad, or if there's problems with them, then we'll talk about that. But let's not start with this kind of rule that says no one gets to use analogies. We're just going to try to use good analogies and not bad ones. And tip number 6. So let's recap. Tip number 1 is make sure you're communicating clearly. That's kind of the check your camp first. Make sure that you're doing a good job communicating. Second, narrate the debate. Number 3, perhaps if you have to, suggest a kind of a golden rule of dialogue. Let's both reason the way we wish that the other person reasoned. Tip number 4, explain that analogies are just analogies. Tip number 5, explain that pro-choice people probably do not want to lose all analogies or the ability to use analogies. And then tip number 6, if the person continues to accuse you of demeaning women or whatever silly thing that they're accusing you of, it might be time to politely end the conversation. If you're trying to have at this point, you're clearly having a philosophical dialogue. The fact that you're talking about degree of dependency and personhood and value and machines the way you are, you're into the philosophy part of the debate, which is where I like to hang out. And if you can't, if you keep on trying to make arguments and the person just keeps on accusing you of crazy things, then it's at some point it becomes not worth their time. Like at some point, there's a line somewhere, right? Can we go? If I'm just imagining someone disagreeing with me, like, no, Josh, it's always worth it. No, I don't think so. Like, would you spend 5 hours with someone that kept responding to every single thing you said by responding with nuh-uh, and like 5 hours of that nuh-uh, 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 you're just wrong? Like, no. At some point, there's a line somewhere. Where it is the hard part, and I've got a little bit of material that I've put together on that. There's a blog article I'll link to in the show notes that I wrote up for Live Action that talked about, what was it called? Pro-lifers need to defend their views too is the name of the article. But at the end, I actually talk about several situations where it's time to probably end the dialogue. But I talk about why it's kind of complicated. It's not a simple thing, trying to figure out when that is. And I tell a story or two of times in the past where I thought that it was time to end the dialogue a long time ago, but then it turns out the very last second, an hour or 75 minutes into it, suddenly the person changes their mind. So it's very difficult to know. But at some point there's a line, and this is kind of there's an accountability that happens. If the person is wanting to dialogue with you, and you basically say, "Look, I'm not going to keep doing this if you're going to keep on doing this, doing that," that might get them to improve their behavior. And if it doesn't, and you leave, maybe they behave better the next time they talk to somebody, or the next time they talk to you. You might even say, "Look, this isn't working right now. I'm not sure why, but this is clearly not working right now. So tell you what, if you want to try this again sometime where you'll actually kind of not assume the worst about me every single possible chance you have, here's my email address." I'd be interested in talking further. I'd be open to talk. I'd probably say I would be open to discussing whether we ought to talk more later. I'm guessing the person wouldn't follow up with you. I have lots of dialogues where it goes great, and I'll give the person my email address, and they never follow up. This is why I'm learning. I really need to be getting their contact info and permission to email them later, because I might have a better chance of actually following up. So if I just say that because if it's not gone well, and you give the person your email address, I'm guessing probably they're not going to email you back. But at least you kind of said, look, I'm open, but we got to agree on some ground rules. And I think that's very fair. And if you know, and I'm dealing with this a little bit sometimes in my personal life, if you kind of have already experience with someone who oftentimes is difficult to have a dialogue with because of just different things that person do, there's a lot of things that can make a dialogue go bad, for just one person to do. Like, just like, oh man, this is not working. At some point, maybe the next time that person wants to talk to you about this, lay out some ground rules first and just say, look, okay, can we agree on a couple of things from the beginning? I'm going to assume the best about you and your arguments. You're going to assume the best about me and my arguments, and we're not going to interrupt each other. You talk, I'll talk. I'll try not to make these really long. Like, this is not going to be a public debate. I'm not going to do a 5-minute speech and make you try to respond to all that. We'll try to make kind of brief arguments, and we'll go back and forth and ask some questions and try to find some common ground. I think that's totally reasonable. And there's people in my life right now where that would be the first conversation we would have before we talk about abortion ever again. And maybe that would make things go well. So anyway, I hope that helps. Good for you for making what I think is probably a good analogy, and I certainly agree with the point that you're making. And once again, just how careful, you can't be too careful talking about abortion. No matter who you're talking to. There's something very emotional about this argument, and for pro-choice people, the idea that we would actually be trying to make a medical procedure illegal, which would force women, if they become pregnant, to not purposefully end their pregnancy. Like, that is terrifying for some pro-choice people, especially if they don't think the unborn is human, and if they think the bodily rights arguments do the job that they're intended to do. So you want to be confident, you want to be persuasive, but you also want to be gracious and kind and not weird. And that's a lot more difficult thing than most people think. So I appreciate that you're trying to do that, Andres. You can always send emails. You can email me at josh@prolifepodcast.net. Or you can also always go to the website, prolifepodcast.net. If you click on About Us, right there on the right, there's a contact form on the right. There's a contact form where you can send your email that way if you prefer. Thanks a lot, and we'll see you next time.